Hello and welcome to today's Encore stream. I'm your host and the community developer for Rocksmith, Doug Lilly, and I want to welcome you to the Encore stream for, what month is this? September. September's Encore stream. We are going to talk about songwriting. We're going to have a discussion about songwriting. If you've never joined into one of our Encore streams, these streams run a little bit differently from our usual Thursday stream, where we're getting instructions from behind the camera. My mistake. So the Encore streams they don't cover the weekly DLC. What they do is we go into a topic that we find interesting. That's a little bit off the regular beaten path of the Thursday stream. So today we'll be talking about songwriting. We might have some guitar playing for demonstration. We might not. We're ready for it in case we want to demonstrate some things. Just to give you an idea of who we have here. Again, I'm Doug Lilly. I'm not a songwriter. I've helped write parts for songs in bands before, but that is not my expertise. My background is more in written writing, like literature. I don't want to say that I'm responsible for literature, but that's where my background is, writing. So throughout this conversation, I'm coming from a place of a bit of ignorance, but mostly curiosity. So I will probably use some terms. I will misuse some terms or use writing terms. Oh, that's going to happen. It's too late. Too late. It's going to happen. It's fine. To my immediate left, we have Andrew Levin. Andrew, you have written, it says here, over 50 songs.
Yeah, somewhere around. Yeah.
And you've released 2 solo EPs.
Mm-hmm.
You have co-written several songs with various groups in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
You have a postgraduate degree in composition and music technology from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and you have a focus on lyrics.
Well, that's definitely one thing that I like to focus on for sure.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And to Andrew's left is Greg Studley. He has a degree in jazz performance. He records sessions for guitar, bass, and piano keyboard. And does it include writing parts when you're recording? Is this like as a session musician?
Yeah, that'll be both writing the parts that fit into the people's songs as well as recording those parts in the studio.
Okay,
yes.
Great. And you have released a solo album just last year called Lost and Found, which you composed and you recorded all the parts for.
With the exception of the drums.
With the exception of the drums. Okay.
I don't like to hit things.
Okay.
I'm a pacifist.
Okay, sure. And then on my far left, probably the screen far right, is Jared McAdams. Jared McAdams. You started playing guitar and bass when you were about 12, 13.
Right in there, yeah.
Yeah, and around the same time you developed an appreciation for classical music.
I
or
did,
classical
yeah.
sort of composition. Could you move your mic a little bit closer?
I did.
Oh, that's way close. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And you studied music composition in college and grad school, and you experimented with different types of music from traditional classical style composition to more avant-garde and minimalist. And then
saying all the right things.
I would
man.
prefer. Well, you sent it to me, and you. I would like you to describe kind of the work that you do currently as far as songwriting.
Yeah, I spent a long time working as a composer for dance companies and theater companies and writing music for those sorts of things and doing my own dance and theater pieces. And now I'm mostly a game developer. I mostly do this. I still write and play, but I'm not like out like these guys going into the studio and on the stage on a regular basis. But yeah, and I've never been a big songwriter per se. I think that is something in our preliminary conversations that Andrew made an interesting point about, like it'll be interesting for us to talk about. I'm sure it's on your list of the distinction between songwriting versus composition and arranging and all the different aspects of writing music that there are.
And we will touch on that a little bit later. Right now I want to say, so what this is going to be is a discussion about songwriting, mostly geared to people who have never written a song or who have maybe started trying to write songs but would appreciate some guidance in that arena. What this is not going to be this is more of a lecture as opposed to a lab. So in the future, there may be some, I'll call lab work, where we are working on a project.
Bunsen burners?
Bunsen burners, test tubes, all
draw
that.
blood.
Yeah, yeah. You get rocks and you have to taste them to see how salty they are. I remember that in lab.
Sounds safe.
And we are also not going to talk as much about arranging. This will mostly be about songwriting, less about arranging, as Andrew pointed out beforehand. And this is not going to be a terribly theory-heavy discussion.
I'm out.
There will be discussion on theory, and I think two of you have brought up interesting points about theory. I'm going to get on my tiptoes so I can see all three of you at once.
I'm just going to pretend like I can see.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
that's
they don't know.
better.
They
That's
don't
much
know.
better.
Is this better?
That's
Yeah,
much better.
yeah,
Thank you,
so
Andrew.
boys.
I'm gonna kind of move, I guess, back a little bit.
So theory will come up, but this is not an encore based strictly around theory. Throughout the stream, if you have any questions, please reach out to Black Widow 9 in the chat. That is Tawny, our community representative, and she will take your questions and send those along to me. And we're also going to have a few giveaways throughout the stream. We're going to have some DLC giveaways. I'm not going to announce those. Tawny will find the right points to release those. So make sure you're listening for her in the chat so you know when to enter the raffles. So I want to get started with the spark of inspiration. So what is normally the first when you're sitting down to write a song? What is the first thing that you do? What is the first thing that draws you into the song? Whether it be a chord, riffs.
Well, I don't think it has to be one thing in particular. It could be, I know for myself, I'll find every time I sit down at an instrument or with an instrument that there's something something that's been in my head that I start noodling around with, and the idea is there, and maybe it's a bit of melody, maybe it's a few chords, maybe it's, I don't know what it is. It could be a rhythmic idea or just a feel, but something that has caught my ear and is awaiting further development.
Okay. Greg?
I'd have to agree that it never really comes from one spot. I mean, I have 50 plus recordings on my phone right now of like either rhythms or riffs or just chord progressions, and any of those can bloom into a song. And sometimes it comes from something that's not even musical. Like, you can just be in an environment that feels inspiring, and it can just make you want to express that musically, in which case it actually doesn't even come from a musical point, but you're able to express yourself through music about how you feel when you're in that environment. I mean, that could be like, looking into the Grand Canyon and being, realizing what perspective is all about, and all of a sudden you're thinking, oh, well, I bet I could do something musical to represent that, in which case it doesn't really come from something musical, but it can be expressed as such.
Thank you. And Andrew?
Yeah. Also, similar lines of it just totally depends on the situation. It can either start from the melody and the chords, or it can start from the lyrics. One practice that I think is a good one to keep the juices flowing is in the book The Artist's Way. I forget the author, but it's a really great book for writer's block is what it addresses. And in The Writer's Way, there's a practice called the morning pages, where every morning, just as you're waking up, you just free write for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just to get your mind in the creative energy. When your mind, when you wake up, your brain waves are in a different state than when you're at work or when you come home from work. And if you can harness that, then it'll just help with creative juices flowing. There's a similar book I recommend called Writing Better Lyrics by Patterson, and he has a similar thing where he just talks about writing every morning. It's definitely a theme that a lot of people have. But then to get more specific with that question, usually I'll either start with the lyrics. So if I'm going through a lot of stuff in life, I'll try and write some lyrics about it that have nothing to do with the music, and then at a later date I'll put music to it.
Yeah.
Or I'll write something instrumental and then try and put lyrics to it. Sometimes it feels forced and I won't put lyrics to it. And
Sure.
keep it instrumental.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from what I'm gathering, it's more or less you're starting with motifs or ideas, melodic concepts.
Yeah, I think usually for me it tends to be start from a harmonic place and then developing melodic ideas in that context.
So what do you
But
mean
not
by
necessarily.
starting from a harmonic place?
It could be a chord, usually a chord progression, or just maybe even just a chord sonority, like a particular chord
Sure.
sound. But yeah, and I think to what Andrew was saying, I think that idea of unstructured creation. I guess the improvisation. Without necessarily the intent that it's going to become a song. Maybe it is, maybe it won't. But just allowing your mind and your fingers to explore whatever musical ideas are knocking around in there, and letting them kind of come out and see if anything catches your ear.
When you are first playing with those first melodic concepts or those first chord either chord shapes or chord progressions, how important is it for you to record or otherwise track when you're just sort of exploring?
For me, I never do. I think it's. I mean, unless I'm doing something specific, unless I'm like trying to capture something that's already sort of worked out, or that I need to generate some audio to work with. But for me, I think just the improvisation without the sense that I'm ever going to evaluate this or necessarily come back and mine this for ideas, but just letting myself work out the ideas, and then the good ones stick.
Okay, Greg.
Yeah, I find that if I do come across an idea when I'm in that state, I will write it down, because they're not necessarily write it down. I'll normally at this point be a little more modern and record it into my phone. It used to be that I would write them down, but I've definitely had that instance where I've come up with a concept right before I'm falling asleep, and go, "Well, that's pretty cool. I don't feel like getting up right now. I'll remember it in the morning." And I wake up and it's gone. I cannot grasp it.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so sometimes you're going to lose it. So if my suggestion would be, if you come up with one that you're going to want to use, and there's any chance that you're not going to remember it later for whatever reason, just get out your phone and record it, because it'll take 5 seconds. And that idea, then you can come back to it later. You can still build upon it. It doesn't have to stay the way it was. You don't have to even show it to anyone if it's an incomplete idea. But you're not going to lose that idea that you came up with. And sometimes those little motifs, those musical ideas, are all you need to develop an entire piece of music upon. But without that little gem, it might never blossom into anything.
And Andrew, I assume, since you're usually starting from a lyrical point.
I wouldn't say I am
Okay,
I'm necessarily starting. No, actually,
I'll take a step back.
Yeah. I would say it's 50-50.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you are starting with lyrics, I assume you're writing.
Yeah.
From the very, like, you might have the germ of an idea and you get that down, and then everything else is on paper or computer. Otherwise.
Well, notepad on my phone.
Notepad.
I definitely spent about an hour and a half just hanging out on my couch, writing on my notepad on my phone a couple nights ago, and that's definitely how I like to do it. Or at the bus stop, or when I'm waiting. And also, to your point with the voice memos, I think that's super important. Definitely just depends on your process. If you're the kind of person that maybe has an idea while you're walking down the street and you want to develop that, or you're setting aside an hour or two where I'm going to write now, that's different. So if you're just having an idea walking down the street or hanging out, it's a good idea to at least have some sort of way to capture that, whether or not it's a voice memo. Obviously, that's not going to sound professional, but I still think it's good to be able to recall those ideas. My memory is not that good, so I have to record these things. Otherwise, they will be gone. I will forget it, like you were saying.
Tufty McTavish wants to know if you hum these musical ideas into your device, your phone, or what have you, when you wake up in the middle of the night. Like if you do have that sort of like spontaneous, like, melodic idea, is it just get it down?
Yeah.
However,
Yeah, you can always pick up your guitar later, or sit at your piano later, whatever your instrument might be, and extract that from your vocal recording. And again, that vocal recording is really for no one except yourself.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll hum stuff into my phone, and later on it becomes a guitar riff.
Right.
Very rarely do I hum and have it become a chord progression. I should say that because I can only hum monophonically.
Yeah.
You probably do polyphonic humming. But my monophonic humming really only works itself in for melodic lines.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I will say that is something that definitely used to piss off my ex-girlfriend. I'd be like at dinner, like, oh, I have an idea, babe. I gotta
Like-
go in the other room.
like
Like, why
mi-
can't you just turn that off?
It's like mid-story. I was like, hold on. Okay, please continue.
Yeah, and you know, I'm curious what your guys' experience was, but you know, I used to teach composition when I was in school, when I was in grad school, and the thing I found is that generally people didn't have problems coming up with a musical idea. What I would have is people coming in with 20 musical ideas and no clear idea of what to do with them or where to
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. And I've run into that same problem where I can start something, but to actually finish it is the bigger battle.
Yes.
Yes, because you have to sometimes you can take a musical idea and force it into a song, and you can hear it. It'll sound forced. There's a way to make an idea let itself flow into a song and let it do what it naturally wants to do, but that's the harder part to do is to let the music do what it wants to, not what you want it to do.
That seems like the connecting the pieces seems where it's very important to have that sort of background in improvisation, where it's most helpful.
That paired with theory, because if you're trying to figure out how to get back to a certain point in a song where you were previously, but you can't quite figure out how to get back there, music theory will sometimes give you at least a good starting point of some ideas that could work for you. And again, it's music theory, so it doesn't always work. But it is very telling of things that people have used in the past and that sounds that we appreciate hearing and that you can use them in your own music.
It gives you some things to try.
Yes.
And maybe in the course, even if you don't use any of those approaches, it might help clarify what you want to happen by hearing what you don't want to happen.
Right.
That was deep.
Did you let's say that again. So please repeat that.
What was it again?
Yes.
Who has a voice memo?
We'll have this.
Oh,
See,
why
couldn't I write it down?
why I wish we were recording this right now.
No, the gist was that, what was I saying? I have no idea.
It was that sometimes you need to hear the things that you don't want to use
Right.
in order to understand what would work.
Right, and that music theory can give you some sort of standard moves, some kind of stock moves that you can try to see if this works. Maybe that's it. Maybe that isn't it, but maybe that gives me an idea of what it could be or what I want it to be.
So like if I know what the sort of leading tone is from chord A to chord B,
Exactly.
which may or may not be A and B.
Yeah, and like Greg was saying, you know, like, I mean, that's a lot of what music theory addresses is how do you get from this to that, and there are standard ways, and then there are kind of non-standard ways, and then there are just wacky, completely original ways that nobody's ever thought of
Right.
before.
Right.
Somehow still work best
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I used to be a big proponent of the idea that in order to break the rules, you needed to know the rules.
Totally.
I'd agree.
And I still think that's true most of the time, but I think there are some sort of self-taught people without hard like education backgrounds in music that can pull off some pretty incredible stuff.
Absolutely.
Incredible things. But being able to have that experience and knowing like what the rule is so that you can work around it with knowledge is
Thank you, Doug.
truly helpful.
One thing that I always like to say, so teaching guitar, I might, want my students to learn how to read notes or whatever, and they go, hey, why do I need to learn how to read notes? Jimi Hendrix didn't know how to read notes. But here's the thing. You aren't Jimi Hendrix. I'm not Jimi Hendrix. Like, it's good to study these things so you can put it in your own vocabulary and you can know what you're writing about.
And study Jimi Hendrix.
Study Jimi Hendrix. Yeah,
no,
totally.
Even if he couldn't explain from a theory standpoint, and I don't know if he could or couldn't.
He knew his scales for sure. People don't talk about that. If you were to ask Jimi Hendrix to play a D Dorian scale, he could do it.
Right. Right. So
You know?
he had that knowledge. It may not have come from the sort of normal place from like a college, but he
Mhm.
knew what worked and what didn't
Totally.
theory wise.
Mhm.
So yeah, so did Jimi Hendrix know what those chords are, how he moved from section to section.
I think I think there are two sides of that. There's the sort of I'm just doing going wherever my ears take me and what sounds right and what feels right. And then I think it's fine if it sounds good, it is good. That's the only rule.
Mhm.
But I think where people struggle is that they're trying to create a sound that matches a sound they've heard before
Yeah.
in music that is following those rules, and they're struggling to find what sounds right in their head. Which would be like the standard sort of chord progression, but they can't figure out what notes to play to get that sound.
Right. To get that sound without having it sound exactly
right.
like what they're trying to sort of emulate.
Right, right.
Yeah, because that's not, if you, there's a question we have that's kind of touches on that, if I can find it. When in the process of songwriting, this is from Totally Not Fio. When in the process of songwriting, do you ever listen to a certain artist's work that hold the backbone of the sound that you want? And how do you work around the original artist's music enough to where you aren't stealing, to where you aren't plagiarizing? So if you do want to, if you hear a song and you're like, I like that style and I want to write something that emulates that style, how do you approach that in such a way that you're not just ripping off the artist?
That's a perfect example. It's a matter of the first step is to understand what's going on. Understand what's going on in the music. What's actually happening here? If I were going to steal this, what would I do?
Right.
And what are the pieces that make this sound the way it sounds? Is it
Like
about
what-
the instrumentation? Is it about the chord changes? Is it about the melody? Is it about the vocal timbre? Is it about the way it's produced?
So what about this is worth stealing?
Or what about
or-
this is
yeah.
appealing to me?
Right.
Yeah.
And then you can sort of take those elements and make them your own, and then that's not stealing. That's
Yeah.
just being inspired by music.
One thing that's a little controversial, is the Blurred Lines, Robin Thicke, Marvin Gaye. What was the song?
Yeah, I know which one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the,
That
the
sounds
Marvin
exactly like
Gaye,
that
Pharrell
Robin Thicke
song. And in my opinion, they didn't steal that. Like, it's a perfect example of, like, okay, the vibe is really, really similar, but the melody's totally different. And actually, from a legal standpoint, the definition of plagiarizing a song is melody and chord progression. So, or actually, sorry,
That's
not
not
chord
chord
progression. No, not chord
progression,
progression. Sorry. Melody and lyrics.
Yeah.
My bad. So, if the melody is pretty much the same, yeah, you should probably change that. But if you really like a chord progression, like, go nuts, use that chord progression. That doesn't. People probably won't appreciate it if your song sounds exactly like another song with a
Right.
different melody on it. So keep that in mind. Try and be creative. Try and change it. But I mean, if stealing chord progressions was a problem, the entire pop music industry would be completely screwed.
Yeah.
All blues
Yeah,
artists.
bebop would not exist.
Bebop wouldn't exist. Blues wouldn't
Well,
exist.
there'd be one
Yeah.
blues artist.
Yeah.
Basically,
That's it.
there would be no music written
Yeah,
after.
exactly.
there'd be
Yeah.
there'd be one guy who played blues and he would be awesome.
There'd be one guy who played blues, and there would be Pachelbel's canon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that'd be
Yeah.
about
Nothing
it.
else has been. Yeah, nothing else has been.
But, So can I answer the question?
Oh yes,
Just
please,
kind of
please.
kind of a little more like specifically to kind of give whomever it wasn't.
Totally not Fio.
Thank you. Just a little like a plan of attack. So
Okay.
if you have this is song A and I want to write something that's very similar to song A. First of all, figure out what the tempo is of song A, so that you can kind of stay close to that tempo range with whatever it is you choose to write. Give yourself a speed to work within. Okay, now dissect. Is it based around a major or a minor chord? Because it's almost always one or the other. It doesn't mean that you're constantly using major or minor chords, but it means you're constantly falling back to a major or a minor chord, because that's going to give a lot of the sound. Then figure out how much of the sound outside of that chord is major or minor. So then you go, well, is the chord progression itself more major or minor? Or is it a 50-50 split? Is it like 60-40? What percentage of my chords are major or minor? And as soon as you do that, you've actually captured a lot of elements. Just with that, by saying, this is the tempo, I'm generally based around a minor chord, and I'm playing 30% major chords around it. And when you write a song that just has that, it's going to have a lot of similarity. It's not going to be the same song, but you're actually capturing a fair amount of information without even looking into what their chord progression was. You're including the same ratio of major minor sound that the other song was, and that will actually hold a lot of value when you kind of compare the two together.
So in theory, you could almost have a spreadsheet where you break down the elements.
If you want to be that anal
If you
about
want
it,
to,
yeah.
if you want to.
But that's
could.
I like
essentially what
spreadsheets. That's all.
but that's essentially what you're doing is you're making a quantifiable comparison. Without having to dive into too much theory, you're just quantifying how much of this is in this song, and can I replicate that amount of element in my song?
Sure.
And when you do, you're going to find that you're starting to create something that has a very similar vibe. It's kind of like if you use the same instrumentation, you get even closer. Like, what instruments? Is there an organ in the background? Well, I guess I should put an organ in the background.
Totally.
And you're getting closer and closer every time you do every bit of analysis that you can do.
And just to say again, and then along the way you discover which of those elements was the one that drew you to the song in the first place.
Dan Emmerich had our own Dan Emmerich had a
The
Dan
the
Emmerich?
Dan
Yeah,
Emmerich
Dan Emmerich.
had a similar question. For years, I was blocked because everything I wrote sounded like something that already existed. So he's not trying to emulate something, but he's finding that when he's writing, it ends up he might be emulating someone else. How do you get around the fear of accidentally copying someone else's work?
Well, first of all, Dan, the thing that's great about music is that, like, it's just who you are. It's your individual expression. So no matter how much you may think it sounds like somebody else, it's still going to sound like you. So, I totally understand that. But I think that just not being afraid and just putting it out there. Another thing that I think can really help is the knowledge that any note will work over any chord. And since you're in the office, we can go over that a little more specifically.
Maybe that can be part of the lab.
Yeah, that could be kind of part of the lab. But from a theoretical standpoint, even if it's super dissonant, every single note will work over every single chord. So if you have a melody that is really pretty singable and catchy, which is a good thing to be, but you maybe the chord progression sounds a little bit stock, which I think a lot of artists fall into, myself included. I think it's a good idea to write a catchy melody with a simple chord progression, and then just change the chords to make it way less common. Take it out of the key.
Like throw in a 13th.
13 or whatever. But I think a good artist to listen to for that is Stevie Wonder. He, in my opinion, is like one of the masters of creating a catchy melody with really cool stuff happening underneath. And you don't really need a whole ton of theory knowledge to know that every note is going to work with any chord if you use your ears and whatnot. So I would just say, Dan, that if you have a song that you like, but maybe you think it's too similar to another song, just try moving around a few of the chords and into something that's unexpected, and maybe even try something that you don't even like that much, but maybe sit with it and see if you like it a little more. And then just making a few small shifts, I think, will make it sound different enough. And beyond that, as long as you're speaking your truth, that's coming straight from the soul, and that's that. Yeah.
There is a in my world of creative writing, there's a concept of hot writing and cold writing, which I wonder how that impacts songwriters. The idea is hot writing is when I write, it's because I have an idea. It's because I have an idea that I have to get down, and then once I get it down, I can work and keep kind of pulling out that idea. And then cold writing would be, I need to write something. I don't have a lot of stuff filtering around, but I have to write. I've set aside this amount of time, Monday through Friday. This is my schedule, and during that time, I need to write. So that's cold writing, where you're not necessarily dramatically inspired to write. How often are you writing in one or the two of the other, where you're extremely inspired and have to get it down, or because you know that you have a gig, you've got a contract, and you need to write something today. You need to start writing today.
I'm normally just, for my lifestyle and line of work, more in the scenario of I write because I want to, because I have something that needs to come out musically.
Sure.
You might be in a different boat, though, because it sounds like you've done a lot of composing, in which case you were probably expected to have compositions ready at a certain time. So you may have done some more of the
I've
other.
been in both boats, and I think we all have at various points. But yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, they're different schools. You know, I think this is exactly the dichotomy I've always thought about with Paul McCartney and John Lennon.
Sure.
John Lennon, it just like poured out. This. I just sound like John Lennon, and here's the song I wrote. And Paul McCartney was like, "Oh, you want one of those? Sure, I can bang one of those out. Oh yeah, oh that's a cool sound. I'll make a song out of that."
Yeah.
And I think that they're different approaches. I think the cold approach takes some work to get to where you can do that, to where you can just crank it out. But it's very satisfying once you do get to that point.
Yeah.
Because then you're not dependent on that inspiration. Oh,
Yeah.
I just had an idea, because you have a process for taking whatever idea is on the table and turning it into something that works.
Like what Andrew mentioned at the beginning of the stream, where you talked about just sort of like free writing for 10 minutes to get your head in that creative space. So I guess if you were to do that, say you were trying to write something on a guitar or a keyboard, 10 minutes sitting down,
First thing in the
improvising,
morning.
just get it out of the way.
And I think that's great for sort of developing that bank of ideas that you can choose from. So then when it is time to sit down and, okay, these people have asked for something along these lines, I have, my Rolodex of ideas, like, okay, I can use this and generate something along those lines.
Totally.
So we another question from Totally Not Fio. Sorry, I think I lost it. Oh, no. Sorry, this one is from Tufty McTavish. How do you develop a chord progression, and what does that mean?
So maybe we should define chord progression.
Sure.
Just for anyone who's watching. So if you sit on one chord indefinitely, it's probably the minimal concept you could actually call a chord progression, because it doesn't progress very much. A chord progression is normally just a sequence of chords that oftentimes does get played in repetition, but doesn't necessarily have to.
Yeah.
So a great example is like the 12-bar blues is a 12-measure chord progression that most blues music relies upon. There are a number of variations on that 12-bar blues, but that 12 measures is normally repeated in repetition throughout a blues song, and so you could say that is a chord progression. So the question was, how do you come up with one?
Yeah, how do you develop a chord progression?
Oh, wow. That's... yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Andrew. There's so many ways to do it. I don't know which one to start with.
I realize
Yeah.
this is a very sort of big idea question that has a lot behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to go back to actually one thing that you said earlier, which is like a lot of times when you're starting a song, you're thinking harmonically. And I actually oftentimes will do the same thing, where I'm thinking about the chord progression first. Either you write the melody first, in which case you're like, how do I make this melody sound cool? Then you write your chord progression. If you're starting with the chord progression, obviously you can just play around until you find something that you like. What I'm usually thinking about is voice leading. So like if I'm playing one note, and I usually do actually write chord progressions on piano because it's easier for me. But just thinking about, okay, I'm here, and then maybe the top note, where would it be cool if that went? Oh, let's take that down a half step. If I take the top note of this chord down a half step, where can I move these other little voices? And I know that's not a super technical answer.
Well,
but
and I think it's important to note, I think people sort of think of melody and chords as these two separate things, but historically that's where chords come from, is from people writing vocal lines that interact in certain ways and happen to line up and make these chords that happen.
On the last stream, on one of the recent streams, we mentioned Crimson, the band that Elisa Rockdock is in. And typically the way they will write songs is she will write a vocal melody, and then Evan will write the chords kind of beneath that to support the vocal melody.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
You can just talk.
One thing, yeah. No, I know. I don't want to interrupt. Anyways, so
Too late. You've interrupted.
Start talking.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing that I wanted to recommend in terms of like the traditional way of writing chords on melody is, if you really want to study this to generate a lot of ideas, which is a good idea, it's a good idea to study some 4-part harmony, some like Bach, some fugue writing. I'm sure that probably everybody here has studied some Bach and 4-part harmony, because that gives you an idea of how to actually deal with voice leading. That doesn't mean that you have to follow the rules of 4-part harmony on every song that you write, but if you know the rules of 4-part harmony, it'll really, I think, drastically improve your ability to move from chord to chord seamlessly and less commonly.
Yeah.
And
But I think a few things you can do, practically speaking, are figure out what all the chords that belong to the key you're in are. So if you're going to play in the key of G, find G and A minor and or a B minor and all the chords that belong to that key, and then you can move between those chords in different ways and see how that sounds. Another thing you can do is think about your bass line. Don't think about necessarily the chords at first. Think about what a satisfying bass movement would be, and then think about how different chords can sit on top of that bass line.
so sort of you're basically dealing with counterpoint.
Right, and that's
yes.
exactly how the sort of harmonic world that Andrew was talking about works. Is you'll have what's called figured bass. You'll have just a bass line, and then you'll have little numbers that tell you what notes to put above that bass line. And that's where a lot of what we think of as chord progressions now comes from, is lines moving over a static bass.
What you mentioned as far as like finding what chords fit within a key signature, I imagine, and I don't know if anybody here knows, but I would imagine, if your theory isn't that strong, if you're just starting out, I'm pretty sure there's got to be some sort of like calculator out there where you just or just a list where you punch in, I'm in the key of G, what chords are available, and it'll just tell you. I imagine that exists.
There isn't another way to do it. The circle of fifths actually works itself out in a way that everything. So I'll see if I can explain it the simplest way without a diagram. The circle of fifths. If you look it up online, you'll see the circle of fifths is always built with C up at what would be 12 o'clock. Everything that C touches, meaning F, G, A minor, which is normally in the same slice as C, D minor, and E minor, that is the key of C. So you can actually take whatever key you're looking at on the circle of fifths and expand it out, and you get all the chords that are located within that key. So you could use the circle of fifths to your advantage for composing in that sense.
Okay, and then you can make minor alterations to any of those.
Well,
experiment with minor alterations.
Yes, you can experiment with them. There are certain alterations that will keep you within the key, and you can alter the chords in other ways that will take you out of the key. So there's nothing quite as explicit an information as that's embedded within the circle of fifths. You have to kind of play around or study the theory to grasp a hold of that. The method I used to use with students who were trying to learn to compose for the first time on the guitar specifically is I'd have them just pick a chord and be like, find a chord that you like the way it sounds. And normally it was like a power chord. Because they're just starting to compose, and it's like, well, power chords, you can kind of move them around and they always sound good. And then I'd say, okay, up or down. When you play that chord, does your brain want the sound to go up or does it want the sound to go down? And they would follow whichever their inclination was. And if it was up, then we would just go up and up until we found that next chord. Then we'd play the first chord and second chord. Okay, those two sound right now. Up or down. And what will eventually happen is you will create a chord progression purely directional. And then if you're like, well, it's just power chords. There's not enough going on. Well, then you go, okay, well, maybe these are major and minor chords. So let's try making each of these major minor. So you start off at a very simple point, but you expand out until your chord progression exists in the realm that you're imagining it.
Interesting.
I think just a very easy starting place for writing rock songs with power chords is just build build power chords off of all the notes of the minor pentatonic scale. So an A power chord, a C power chord, a D power chord, an E power chord, and a G power chord, and then just move around between those chords. And you can build a very satisfying chord progression just out of doing that.
Yeah.
Here's the cool thing about that too, is if you use that, it'll all sound super in that like rock vein. But if you just alter one note, like just move literally, you're using that, and then you just move up one fret, then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, they just did something
Yeah.
cool and creative there.
Because that's where that
Yeah.
surprise is. Because
Yeah.
you'll start to the listener will start to expect
Yeah.
what's coming, and then when you subvert those expectations,
Exactly.
that's when
Yeah, make something and then break it.
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Break it and break it.
I would like to go over some more of these questions. We're currently about a little over halfway through, probably.
Okay.
It's a very dense topic.
I'm glad we're not getting too much into theory.
I'm holding back. All right, I'm holding back.
It's hard.
Totally not. Theo has a few questions. What is the hardest part of songwriting for you, and where does a roadblock normally hit you?
Andrew?
Yeah, I can answer
Just
that.
backed out.
I can answer that. A few things. Number one, if I write the music but the lyrics aren't coming to me. Number two, if I write the lyrics and the music isn't coming to me. That can be tough. I think that one thing you were talking about with cold writing, where you can just like access the music and let it pour out, I think that is something that just takes a long time of practice and doing it to make that happen. And until you get to that point, you will reach writer's block in all aspects, be it lyrically, be it your chord progression, be it once you start producing the song. That's actually a lot of times where I find myself running into writer's block, is once I actually go to produce and arrange the song, which isn't the same as songwriting itself. Maybe I'll be doing it and I'll get like 2 minutes of the song perfect, and then my computer will start crapping out and I can't use any more plugins, and then I have to, and then I'm like 6 months later like, oh, here's this song that I have epically done for 2 minutes, and then it just kind of
doesn't know where to go.
patters out. One thing I do want to talk real quick about is the idea. Coming up to this, I actually watched some interviews of some different songwriters talk about where inspiration comes for them, and this is somewhat relevant to that. And there was this songwriter I saw this weekend. I played at a music festival in Joshua Tree, and there was this artist, Mike Love, who's the reggae artist, and I was totally blown away by him. He does this crazy looping thing, but his songwriting is beautiful. And anyways, I listened to this interview with him yesterday where they were talking about his songwriting process, and he was saying for years he would write songs. He wrote over 100 songs that he didn't like, and he didn't want to share with anybody. But then he had an epiphany that he wasn't writing the songs, and he can't take credit for the songs, that he is a conduit for some sort of other force in the universe of creativity. And once he was able to tap into that, he doesn't run into writer's block. So in practice, how you could maybe do that is just writing a ton of songs and getting it faster and faster until you find a way that system that works for you. But also things like meditation, things that are a little bit more esoteric. Go on a trip, go outside, go on a hike.
Just have experiences outside of your normal day to day. That there was a topic that I was going to bring up later that I think is similar to this, and that's just overcoming the fear of failure. And I feel like a lot of writer's block comes from that fear of failure. That
Absolutely.
fear of that you've got the blank page, and now you have to fill it with something, and you want it to be good. But what if it's not? Oh no! What if I can't write a good song right now?
Mm-hmm. I think Ira Glass has a great thing on this where he talks about how most of what you do is going to be bad. And that's expected. And you shouldn't expect that you sit down and just write a masterpiece right out of the gate. And even after doing it for years, you shouldn't expect that every time you sit down it's going to be a home run and it's going to be easy. That's the way you get good is by being bad for a long time and then eventually
failing faster.
Yes, yeah. Fail as I think that there's a cool quote that's something like the master has failed more times than the beginner has tried.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's good. I like that.
So I think not worrying about it necessarily always being a home run. You can sit down and I think there's I know what's the Brian Eno thing, the nonlinear strategies or whatever. He's got this whole thing of like these note cards that have different strategies for solving problems and things like that. But just thinking of practical things like that you can do, like I'm gonna play this backwards. I'm
Yeah.
only gonna use major 7 chords. I just like imposing some like off the wall wacky restriction on
Yeah.
yourself, and then since your options are more limited, it's easier to explore them.
I'm a big fan of limitations in art, and creating those restrictions for yourself to have to work within and maybe work around when able.
Yeah, so I think that's super on the ball. Or on the money, whatever it was that was on it.
The money
ball. So yeah, no, like I was talking earlier about how sometimes I'll run into like writer's block. I'll be in my DAW, I'll put on 50,000 plugins, and then run out of CPU power, and then give up on the song. I borrowed an OP1, which is this little 4-track production device, about a year and a half ago. It got me hooked on hardware. And kind of ever since then, everyone in the office knows I'm kind of obsessed with like music hardware. And it's one of the reasons is because it's more limiting. And I've produced way more stuff since I started getting like really limited, not always good stuff, and limited myself to writing there and not taking it to the DAW till the ideas were
Because
finished.
let me make sure that I and the viewers understand. So when you're dealing with a 4-track record like that, you can record 4 times. Or 3 times and then
4.
bounce. You can record 4 times and then kind of bounce them all to one track. And so now those four tracks are locked together.
Yeah.
And they cannot be separated. You can then add up to 3 more tracks and bounce them down. But once they're there, they're sort of in place and they're not as movable as they would be. So once they're sort of locked in, unless you're starting over from scratch, recording wise, you're dealing with what you have and you have to work with what you have.
Yeah. Sgt. Pepper was recorded on a 4-track.
Yeah, everything before, 68, 67, something in there.
One of the things to keep in mind about like a blank page is that if you take really hits, what you call hit songs, really popular tunes, ones that have kind of even stood the test of time, when you really break those songs down, they're super easy most of the time. Like at their core, they're pretty simple repetitive chord progression, and then they go to another repetitive chord progression that they come back to later. So most songs really only have 3 parts. And that's the thing to remember. A blank page is not really entirely blank once you start writing. Like once you write line 1, line 1 probably exists somewhere down by line 9 as well.
It should.
There's a really good chance that line 1 is line 9. So once you begin, that whole page is actually starting to be filled out. So just keep in mind that you don't need 3 minutes worth of material to write a 3-minute song.
Right.
You need about a minute of material and just arrange it all in the right order, and you've got a 3-minute song.
And when you're first starting out, there's nothing wrong with using the template, the verse, chorus, verse, bridge.
Not at all.
And even within those sections, there's going to be a certain amount of repetition. You're probably you're going to have 2 or 4 or 8 phrases, and basically you're going to take one of these little snippets of an idea that we were talking about before, and then you can repeat that, okay? And then let's take the second one and give it a different ending. Okay, now my 2-bar idea is now a 4-bar idea. Now I'm going to repeat that again, but I'm going to transpose the whole thing up and put it over a different chord. Okay, now my 4-bar idea is an 8-bar idea, and that's a verse. Okay, now I've got 3/4 of my song done.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Another question, this one from Paterbot 2000. How do you expand one cool riff you stumble into while noodling into an entire song? How does that... Just wait,
Yeah.
by
I'd have to agree that was the answer.
All right. I wish I would have listened instead of reading the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing too is just like kind of motivic development, kind of is what you were talking about, and even like the most complex songs in the world have good motivic development.
I mean,
Like,
motif is a concept, a musical concept in a song.
yeah, or just like a very short melody.
Ba
right?
ba ba ba.
Ba 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 ba. It's the same thing. Just
Just a little bit different.
yeah, exactly. Just took
And then
it.
it's repeated over and over again.
Yeah, and nobody's sitting around going. Yeah, nobody's sitting around going like Beethoven's writing too simple music, man.
No, that's
Like-
that's where the meaning of music comes from. Is what happens to these little ideas and how they get transmogrified and moved around and repeated and shortened and lengthened. It's if you write just a really long melody that goes all over the place, that can be beautiful too. But it's harder to follow. It's harder to understand what's going on. That motivic development is what makes something feel cohesive.
I would often, in describing, I would use this more for improvisation than composition, but it holds just as true for composition, is I used to hate it when I was younger and people would say, oh, well, writing a song is like telling a story. And I'm like, no, they're different things. But the truth is, what you were just saying, like that really long melody, that's a run-on sentence. And you might lose people by the time that sentence is over because they're going to forget what it was even about when you started. But small ideas that then is like that's like a sentence. And then the next sentence has something to do with the previous because otherwise it makes no sense. And in that respect, a section of a song is literally a paragraph. And by the time you're done, your song is a story. It's a short story. It's got paragraphs. It's got sentences. It has punctuation. Like, you want to put a hard stop on beat 4 and let the music breathe for a second. Well, that's an exclamation point.
Right.
I mean, it really does carry over. I never really liked it that much when I was younger to kind of make that analogy. But the more I've written and improvised, both of those things, both in composition and improvisation, you have to think about it like everything you're doing has to have something to do with what you've already done, or it has to somehow tie back in later.
Yeah,
just as
grammar.
As you
don't
would
just
with a
put
story.
Words that sound cool in any cool sounding order. I mean, you can.
Right.
T.S. Eliot.
If your artistic expression is like, I want to be the dude that makes really like hard to understand, like long
Refrigerator fire truck.
Yeah, like if that's what you want to do, then
See?
yeah, but
You said it all, man.
yeah.
And this is related to the next question from Tiffany McTavish. Do melodic ideas tend to evolve as skill level develops? Does more experience open up new possibilities melody-wise?
I would say so. Yeah.
Do you run the risk of having those sort of run-on sentences once you have the vocabulary to have a run-on sentence? Is there a risk of entering that world?
I think a lot of people go through a stage where it's like, okay, I've been playing for a while and my ears are opening up and I'm learning cool new chords and I'm learning how to move around and the complexity of harmony, and then all their material gets very complex and very it's like, oh, I've got to use every idea and every advanced chord progression idea, and I've got to modulate all over the place or whatever it is. And I think the next phase after that is learning how to use those things as tools in your toolbox, but not something like you feel like you have to put everything in all the time.
Just learning to edit.
Yeah.
That's actually that brings me to an idea that I did want to talk about. Where does the act of subtraction play much in your songwriting?
Yeah.
More is more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's got to.
But what I mean for the viewers is you have a song or part of a song written. How often do you just do you remove a piece, even if it's just like, you know what, I'm not going to use the fifth. I'm not going to use the fifth throughout the song, or I'm just going to reduce the complexity in order to change focus.
Well, I mean, not using the fifth, I think, is a great example, and like voicing chords. I think there's a stage for pianists in particular where they want to cram in every note, every tension, every cool, weird sounding thing, and get really crunchy sounds because they sound awesome on their own.
Yeah.
But then when you start lining them up back to back to back to back, it's too much, and you've got to think about the processing power of your listener.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I got an analogy for that. So they did a study. The people
The
did a
scientists.
study. Yeah, them did a study where they found that the number one factor of success in people's careers is the size of their vocabulary. Right. So if you have,
Indubitably.
yeah. So if you have a very wide vocabulary, you are like hella gonna do well and stuff. But music being language, a means of expression, is the same thing. If you have a very wide vocabulary musically, you study lots of different types of music, lots of different traditions of music, lots of different elements of theory, lots of different players, you have a very wide vocabulary, then you have more stuff to draw upon, and that will help with your success in writing. Now, on the flip side of that, if you talk to somebody who has a very wide vocabulary and you're hanging out with them in the elevator and they're just sitting there listing off all the words that you don't understand, you're going to be like, who is this dude that's trying to just use all these words I don't understand? That's annoying, you know? And I also don't think that in the study they said, hey, people who use vocab words all the time are doing well. That's not the study. The study is just the ability to use those words. So studying these concepts doesn't mean you have to use them all of the time. And in fact, having a few ideas in one song allows you to then use different ideas in different songs, which then allows you to have a broader catalog of music that's interesting.
I think you mentioned Stevie Wonder earlier. You know, I think a lot of his melodies are very simple, very you know, they're just pentatonic and very catchy and singable, with very interesting, complex harmony going on underneath. And I think it's you got to pick your battles. Pick what's the thing that people can grab onto, and then what's the thing that you can kind of mess around with and comment on that with.
So what's for the listener and what's for me?
No, sort
Yeah,
of.
kind of in a way.
I was just listening to the new Tool album, which I really, really dig a lot, and definitely check that out. And one thing that struck me was like a lot of the guitar parts were, I mean, it's super, super progressive. So obviously Tool is like lots of different ideas, but like a lot of the guitar parts were relatively simple and singable, but the drums, that element of the song was super, super, super complex. So they also picked their battles. It was like the rhythmically super complex, harmonically not particularly complex.
I would say that rhythm and texture are the two things that I think this new album is mostly built around.
Totally.
In my reading, my listening of it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about materials. So if you're sitting down to write a song, I've got 3 tiers I want to talk about. What materials, and this can be hardware, software, writing notepads, just anything that you think you might be helpful. What is mandatory, what is practical, and what is a luxury? What might be nice to help in your songwriting? So let's start with mandatory. What do you need if you're going to start writing songs?
I personally, I wouldn't put anything in that. I mean, you need your own imagination and your ears and maybe your vocal cords. I think that's you can go a long way with just that. But just one itty bitty step above that, I'd say, you know, some kind of instrument, something to write on, something to write with, is more than adequate.
Yeah, I would definitely say an instrument being a mandatory element, though keep in mind nowadays that instrument could literally be your computer. And
Your phone.
you can you can come up with those ideas without a physical guitar in front of you, but you could open up your laptop and go into some software you have and write down your ideas or come up with them in there using MIDI. So an instrument is anything that you can use to have some kind of note playback. Be it the one you can play or the one you can notate into a program.
Okay. And what are some things that might be very practical? It might not be mandatory, but they're very practical, and if you are writing songs on a regular basis, would be very good to have.
I'd say at least an instrument, as people were saying, because I mean, actually, in terms, Well, anyways, a guitar or piano. Or some sort of instrument that's polyphonic is really nice to have. Only having monophonic is going to make it more difficult. That's why most great like saxophone players and whatnot still play some piano. So that's number one. That's really nice to have. Number two is some sort of multi-track recorder, be that a DAW on your computer, be that a 4-track, 8-track, whatever, just so you can record your ideas and then stack other ideas on top of them.
Sure.
And I think one question is who's the audience for this? Who am I passing this off to? Am I going to go to band practice and show this to the other people in the band and work through it together? Am I going to have this published somewhere? Am I handing this off to an ensemble who's going to perform it? It depends on like what stage you need, or am I just going to record this myself and produce it? Or for me, or for release, or for whatever purposes. But just knowing, am I making notes for myself, or am I communicating this to some specific person out in the world who's going to have to interpret it? Would change, what I would how I would document it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Okay. And then luxury. Are there any songwriting sort of luxury materials, items or software? Velvet, just coat the walls and velvet.
Plugins.
Plugins.
Plugins, and more plugins.
Is that where all the money goes, into plugins? Just
that's where
external gear.
Hardware and software. You can just keep adding it in, but I mean that gets into the like actual production. That's not really the songwriting side, as much as it is like I want to now produce the sound of my song, and that's where those things. But as far as songwriting goes, I don't know if I'd really put anything in the luxury.
Maybe notation software. I think that's something you can do it by hand, but it's it's 2019. Live a little. I got finale or whatever.
Yeah.
I got some luxuries for you. A massage, hot springs.
Get you that relax.
Whenever inspiration isn't coming, you gotta call.
A cabin in Hawaii.
That's
a luxury to you?
With air conditioning.
Totally Not Theo wants to know if what software you do prefer using when songwriting, and if there are any free alternatives to what you if you're not using it free.
So there's two. I would consider two realms of how to do this.
Okay.
One of them being music notation software, and one of them being a DAW. So for music notation software, the big two that would be in like the professional range of what people use would be Finale and Sibelius. However, there are freebies online. MuseScore is one of them.
Pretty good.
Note Flight.
Yeah, there's a bunch of freebie softwares that you can use for music notation. The catch is you actually have to know what notes you're playing in order to write it into that software. So that's why I kind of put it in its own category. But the DAW software, being the digital audio workstation, there's a bunch of them. Pro Tools is the one that you're normally going to find when you walk into a studio. But, Logic for Apple is a really good one. I personally like using Cubase. There's tons.
Ableton is really good for songwriting.
Reaper's a free one.
Reaper.
Right? So there are free versions of all of these. It's just a matter of whether you know what it is you're composing, in which case you can use notation software. But if you don't know what it is what you're actually playing on your instrument, then I would suggest one of the digital audio workstations are actually the better choice, because they're a little more free for you to figure stuff out while you're composing.
And that's really how I learned to compose way back in the day, was by having basically a MIDI sequencer and just moving the notes around in the MIDI sequencer, and you can just draw notes in wherever you want them and see what sounds good, and just kind of figure it out and just explore that without and then you have the ability to explore things that are beyond your ability as a performer even.
We're currently just after 4 o'clock. Are we okay going another 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Is everybody okay? Do we have a meeting? You got to head out, Jared?
No, it's
okay.
Do you know who I am?
I do. I do. So here's, I think this is an interesting question for me. And this is another one from Totally Not Theo, which I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm saying her name a lot. I hope I'm saying it correctly. What's one idea that can be learned from songwriting and applied to our lives as listeners?
Hello.
Yeah.
From the actual act of songwriting, or from listening to songwriters?
Patience.
Yeah, patience.
So as a listener, you learn.
Well,
as a listener.
Well, in the process of songwriting, what lessons do you learn as a listener? Like, do you listen to music differently after you learned how to write songs than you did before?
Well,
I think that's the question.
Going back to that thing that I said before, I think you get better at picking out what it is that makes this song sound like this song. Yeah. What it is that gives me that feeling when I listen to "The Tide Is High" by Blondie. That one evokes something that Patience by Guns N' Roses doesn't.
Right,
They
right.
they each occupy their own space, and that's very ephemeral and ethereal when I think you're just meeting those things as a listener. Once you start thinking about things in terms of how the song is put together and what the ingredients are, you can start. I mean, it's like it's like a chef. A hint of saffron. You just notice those.
So it
things.
develops your palate.
Yeah, I think that's a way to say it.
Yeah. One thing that I definitely would like to say is I have for a long time really wanted to be able to listen to music from the perspective of a non-musician, because that's something I haven't been able to do since I was 11 years old. I started taking it pretty seriously, like at a pretty young age, and I remember being a kid, not knowing what was going on with music and just listening to it and loving it so much. And
then you start getting opinions.
Yeah,
on
then I started
things.
getting opinions. And so the last several years have actually, for me personally, been like an exploration and trying to reconnect with that.
That's hard.
It's hard. But like, songwriting, music is, I think that's one of the reasons that something like songwriting is such a hard thing to talk about, because there's two elements. You have the technical elements, theory, what goes into the song, and then you have the spiritual, for lack of a better word, elements of like, how does it make you feel? What are you even trying to accomplish? What's the point? And those are two different things. And I think that a lot of great songwriters have explored both. And so in terms of something that you can really take to your life from songwriting, because songwriting can be related to pretty much any aspect of life, be that pain, be that happiness, be that being a good person, be that shopping at the mall, be that trying to get money, like there are so many avenues that it really depends on what you're listening to and what you're writing about. It can be used for good or for bad.
So when you sit down to write a song, do you have any goals in mind ever outside of, I just want to write something that sounds good or sounds cool? Like, do you have objectives beyond that? Like, is there any sort of gamification? Like, and that's, again, kind of going back to the limitations. Or is there something you're trying to prove that you can do that nobody else can do? Are any of those compulsions there when you sit down to write a song? And if they were, would you admit it?
I can't speak to that. I don't. It's hard to say. I mean, like every time I write a song, it's its own experience and sometimes its own battle to be able to do it. So it's hard to say whether there's ever like a general mindset that goes along with it if there's something else trying to be done. I mean, normally I take it as my goal is to actually finish the song, because that I've often found is the hardest is the hardest part. Is that there's plenty of times I have started songs, and that's where it has stopped, because I never actually figured out how to get to the end of the song. So for me, always the first goal is, can I finish it? Can I make it from start to finish in this song? And then it's like, okay, well, what do I want to do with it? Like, do I just want to have this as a song that I can like play for my friends? Do I want to produce this and put it online? Do I want to shop it to Rocksmith and try and get it in the game? You never know. So it all depends. There has to be the immediate goal of the song's done, and then the next goal of, now what do I want to do with this now that I've done it?
So that answer, there was another question. Have you ever left a song complete for a long time and eventually come back to it and revamped the entire thing? Like, you finished it, but maybe you did as much with it as you could in that moment, and then you finished it and you're like, I can't do anything with this, and you come back a year or so later.
10 years.
So what happened? How do you revisit an old song?
I personally wrote an acoustic song with a friend of mine called Fiction, back when I still lived in South Carolina, and then I decided to actually finally record the song on my album that I did last year, and I changed almost all the lyrics. And in doing so, I also revamped, because it was always just an acoustic song, and it became a production of a song. And so a lot of things changed. I mean, the core of the song was still there, but lyrics got thrown out and new ones came in, and it was not the same song that it was. And it was funny, because if my dad's ever watching this, he'll always say, You know, I like the original one better. I like
Yeah.
the old version.
Yeah.
So if I'm ever playing it for him, I go back to the original lyrics because he appreciates
Like
it.
when you get those demo tapes, those bootleg demo tapes of some of your favorite bands, like what the songs were, like
Oh,
the old demos before
exactly.
they
before they
went to the
really
studio.
got
Yeah.
recorded, and it's
It's
like,
just
oh, that's
raw
not the
and,
same song
like
anymore.
interesting
Yeah.
decisions. You made.
Yeah, well, I think not exactly the same thing, but I know at the end of the process, you've been living with this thing for a while, and I know for myself, sometimes I'm kind of sick of it.
Oh,
by
yeah.
the time I get to the end,
There is that.
and
yes.
whatever magic there was at the beginning, I'm over it.
Yeah.
You know? and you know, sometimes I'll hate it, and sometimes I'll put it on a shelf and say that didn't come out good. I'm not happy with that. I'm gonna do something different. Then I'll come back to that after a while and say, oh, actually, it was pretty good. It was all right. It was all right. Or you know, vice versa. Like, oh, this is great. This is the best thing ever. And then you know, years pass, and you're like, that was a little bit trying too hard, maybe.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring up one other thing. It's kind of off, but I don't want to forget to say it.
Sure.
It's more of like a general rule for songwriting that I would suggest people try and employ in their songwriting process. Listen to the song. Once you feel like your song is a song, you're like, okay, this is how I think I want this to go. Listen to it and pretend it's not you.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're so the mind process of playing a song and listening to yourself while you're doing it is different than listening to that exact same take of the song without you singing and playing it, with just you listening to it. If you had recorded it, when you sing, you know what you're about to do in your head. When you play, right before you play, you make a decision on what you're going to do. You actually know what's about to happen, and then you hear it. But when you actually listen back to it, you lose that element. And when it comes at you fresh. It comes at you like it could be someone else. And if you can still like your song when you listen to it that way, when you're not actually doing that in the moment, when you're not playing it or singing it in the moment, that's when you know that you will like your song. Because most times when I hear my songs back, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I like that part. But I never realized it until I heard it in that sense when I wasn't actually playing it. So I would suggest that people try and do that.
I think a related thing that I think is useful, especially when you're sort of late in the process but not quite done, is approaching the song as if you're doing a cover of somebody else's song. And it's like, okay, this is an existing thing, and I'm going to mess around with it and make it my own, even though it already was my own. But just giving it that space to like, okay, it's gotten to this point, and it's kind of Frankenstein together, but I'm going to give it space to kind of gel and drift a little bit here and there and become a cohesive thing.
And even that, if you put a song down for a year, 2 years, in that year or two, your tastes, like you can be listening to something else completely different, and that could be what's sort of inspiring you. So if you are making a cover of your own song, you're putting like today's Doug's taste on top of it to make it. We talk about making the song your own a lot, and that can be different. Like making my own song my own from 2 years ago can make it sound completely different, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, one other thing too is like maybe we could talk a little bit about like what makes a song really
Like
a great song.
Sure.
But like if once you finish the core of the song, the lyrics, melody, chord progression, that's kind of the core. Then after that, you're arranging it. In my opinion, a really, really great song will work in any style, in any genre. Like Amazing Grace is a good example. Like there's a ton of different versions of that song. It's always going to sound, if you like Amazing Grace, it's always going to sound like a great song no matter. So anyways, to that point, I think try maybe taking your song and doing it in a different style. Like try putting it in double time. Try putting it in a different. Try putting in some new textures.
Amazing bass.
Amazing bass, man. I'm sure that there is a solo bass cover of Amazing Grace, probably by Victor Wooten.
Probably.
That's probably really good. So.
Yeah, that kind of takes me back to the oblique strategies thing of being able to sort of like have just have your own checklist of things I can try, things I can play. I'm gonna play this as a reggae. I'm gonna try to play it backwards. I'm gonna try to just do some sort of secondary processing on this that takes it away from where it is, just at very least so that you can come back to the original idea with fresh ears.
Speaking back to coming back to the original idea, we are about out of time, and I very much liked this conversation and would like to revisit this in the future. So let us know what you think about this conversation. We are on Twitter and Instagram. Both of those are at Rocksmith Game. You can let us know what you thought of this stream there. We are also on Facebook, just facebook.com/Rocksmith. Before we go, I do want to ask, in a minute or two, do you have any necessary advice that you wish we could have covered in this unfortunately short discussion that you did not get to mention?
I mean, the only thing I would say is just do it. Just sit down and start writing it down or playing it or however you want to do it. Just start now and do it a lot.
My last piece of advice would be, if you start a song and it's not working out, don't stop. Just start the next song.
Good.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, nothing that I necessarily haven't already said, but just to kind of summarize and like bring it home, like songwriting, there are two really important elements. You have the technical side of things, learning your theory, all that kind of stuff, and then you have the more esoteric, spiritual side of things. Try and work on. Don't ignore either of those. Work on them both.
All right. I'd like to thank our panelists once more. We have Andrew Levin directly to my left, Greg Studley in the center there, and Jared McAdams. Nice to have you back on stream.
It's been a while.
Have you been? I don't know if have you been on stream since I've been around?
Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe.
I think maybe.
Maybe
I
once.
don't know. Yeah,
I don't know.
Maybe once. It's been a while.
I'm happy to have you. It's happy to have you.
be here.
And I was happy to have all of you here with us. Thank you for tuning in. I'll get through this. It's fine. Live TV. What are you going to do? We will be back on Thursday at 3 p.m. Pacific time for our usual weekly dev stream. This week we'll be playing the songs of Amaranth. So stay tuned for that. And thank you once more for joining us. Farewell.